told that the people who lived during the days of Rasulullah, those who were known as Muslims, all had same perspective about the value of the words of Rasulullah. This is not the reality. Actually, there was a circle among Muslims in Medina, especially those who belonged to the elders of the Qurayshi, especially Banu Umayyah, who actually looked at Rasulullah and whatever he said, and they would actually pick and select whatever they want. They did not believe that whatever he says is, valid and applicable to us. Means his words were not considered as hujjat. There was a young man from among them by the name of Abdullah bin Amr ibn As. You must have heard the name of Amr ibn As, who later on became a senior advisor of Muawiyah, and these are all from Banu Umayyah. He had a young son by the name of Abdullah. During the days of the Prophet, he was a young person, and he was among the few those days who was literate. They knew how to read and write. Literacy was not a common, quality those days. And he himself, and all these narrations here are from the sources of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Amr ibn As says himself, this is his narration, where he says, "Kuntu aktubu kullu shay'in asma'uhu min Rasulillah." It seems he had this habit of keeping a pen or a pencil those days, or whatever the material they used to use for writing and preserving things. So he says, whenever I would go in the audience where the Rasul would be there, whatever I hear from him, I would write it down in my notebook. فَنَحَتْنِي قُرَيْشٍ. But the elders of Quraysh forbid me from doing it. وَقَالُوا, and they said to me, تَكْتُبُ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ سَمِعْتُهُ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ بَشَرٌ يَتَكَلَّمُ فِي الْغَضَبِ وَالرِّضَى. They said, what's the matter with you? You're writing everything that you hear from him? He's just a human being like us. Sometimes he's angry, sometimes he's overly, joyful and happy. So don't take his words that seriously. He might say things out of anger sometimes, and sometimes he might be, overjoyed with something and he would exaggerate things. And so he said, when they told me this way, I stopped writing it. But then he realized that maybe I should go and ask Rasulullah himself. So he says, فَأَمْسَكْتُ عَنِ الْكِتَابَ. I stopped from writing these statements of Rasulullah. But then one day, فَذَكَرْتُ ذَلِكَ لِرَسُولِ اللَّهِ. Then I mentioned one day, I told the Prophet I had this habit of writing down whatever I hear from you. But his elders of Quraysh told me not to do this, because you are bashar, and sometimes you say things out of ghazab and sometimes out of rida. فَأَوْمَعَ بِأَصْبِعِهِ إِلَى فِيهِ. This is Abdullah bin Amr ibn As. He says, the Prophet pointed with his finger towards his mouth, and he said, "Uktub, write down whatever you hear from me. فَوَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ. I swear in the name of the Lord who holds my life and my soul, مَا خَرَجَ مِنْهُ إِلَّا حَقٌّ. Nothing comes out of my mouth but that it's based on haqq and the truth." Salawat upon the Prophet. So we already see that there was a tendency, we already see that there was a tendency among some Muslims in Medina that they did not consider the words of Rasulullah to be always applicable and valid for them. They would say he is bashar, يتكلم في الغضب والرضا, and this is where we see that there was a different perspective there, and there was another group who believed that Rasulullah, whatever he says, he is the embodiment of haqq and truthful for us. Even Rasul himself, He clarified this issue. Whatever comes from my mouth is based on haqq and the truth. Therefore write it down. And so the sunnah of Rasulullah is that whatever you hear from me, write it down and preserve it if you can in the written form. This is what we hear. But then, was this sunnah of the Prophet or the tradition enforced by others? No. We see a similar, kind of mentality in the famous incident. You must have heard it many times. And this is from Sayyid Bukhari during the early days of the later days of the Prophet, actually when he was about to die. The whole incident where he says, "I'tuni bi kitabin aktubu lakum kitaban la tudillu ba'du." Bring a paper to me so that I may write down or I may dictate to you something, kind of a will, that after that you will never go astray. And there were people, family members as well as some companions were around, and they knew that whenever the prophets had said "La tadhillu ba'di" or "ba'duhu," that after that guidance or after me you follow that, you will never go astray. Whenever he uses those terms, they were clever enough to know that he would talk about Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, and so they prevented him. So we see this is where we see that they actually prevented him. He's still alive. Where he becomes so angry, the Prophet says, when they started fighting among one another, should we give him the paper or not? Should we bring the pen or not? And who said no. And this is where he says, the Prophet became angry, "Qum anni," get out of here. This is not the place where you should be quarreling and fighting with one another. So we see that there was a tendency already in the life of the Prophet of a group of people who did not consider the words of Rasulullah to be authoritative all the time. And they were not into this issue of preserving it, where we see that Rasulullah himself is saying, "Uktub," write down, because nothing comes out of my mouth but that it is based on haqq and the truth. And when you see later on, the early Khilafat did not go by the sunnah of Rasulullah. There is a whole section in the history of hadith. Studying hadith is one thing. Studying the history of hadith, how it basically started and how it was compiled later on. There is a whole section where they talk about man'u kitabat al-hadith, prohibition of writing down the hadith. Early Khulafa, the first Khalifa as well as the second Khalifa, they aggressively forbade people from putting the hadith of Rasulullah in a written form. They were not even happy when people were circulating the hadith by words. Later on, the issue of writing down, to the extent we see that the first Khalifa, when he got hold of about 500 ahadith of Rasulullah, he spent the whole night thinking about it. What should I do? Next morning he gave the order that these ahadith in the written form be burnt down. Why? This is where they say, "Oh, we would like to preserve the Quran." Another statement that we have from him, and this is Zahabi quoting, إن أبا بكر جمع الناس بعد وفاة نبيهم, that the first Khalifa after the death of the Prophet gathered the people, فقال إنكم تحدثون عن رسول الله أحاديث تختلفون فيها. This is the early days. It says, you people have been quoting ahadith from the Prophet, and they are not always the same, and the people after you would be more confused. Therefore, فَلَا تُحَدِّثُوا عَنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ شَيْئًا. Do not narrate anything from Rasulullah at all. فَمَنْ سَأَلَكُمْ فَقُولُوا. If anyone asks you a question, just say to them, فَقُولُوا بَيْنَنَا كِتَابَ اللَّهِ. We have the book of Allah. We have the book of Allah, فَاسْتَحِلُّ حَلَالَهُ وَحَرِّمُوا حَرَامَهُ. Whatever the Quran says is halal, accept it as halal. Whatever the Quran says is haram, that should be considered as haram. And so we see that when it comes to the issue of labels, labels can be very misleading. This was the official policy of the early Khilafat of not preserving the ahadith of Rasulullah in the written form. This continued on with the second Khilafat, where he consulted the companions of the Prophet for compiling the ahadith of Rasulullah in the written form. And all of them suggested to him that this is a good idea, because the more we move away from the time of the Prophet, we will be forgetting what he said. After thinking over this issue for a month, it took him a month to think about it. He gathered them, and then he announced his prohibition for writing down the ahadith. Not only that, many companions had already gone out of Medina to other cities in various positions as governors or judge or different administrative posts given to them. And some of them, since they have lived with Rasulullah, they heard many things from him. They had this habit of quoting Rasulullah on many things. He actually called them back to Medina. And the words are from the historians here that ما مات عمر بن الخطاب حتى بعث إلى أصحاب رسول الله فجمعهم من الآفاق. That Umar, during his latter part of his Khilafat, he aggressively went after this policy of calling all the prominent Sahaba from outside Medina back to Medina, people like Abdullah bin Huzaifa, Abu Darda, Abu Zar, Uqba bin Amir, and then he gathered them and he says, ما هذه الأحاديث التي أفشيتم عن رسول الله في الآفاق. He says, what is this I hear that you are spreading ahadith of Rasulullah in different cities? قالوا تنهانا. They responded to him by saying, are you prohibiting us from circulating the ahadith of Rasulullah? He says, no, I'm not doing that, but I would like you to stay here in Medina with me. Don't go outside anywhere. Actually, some of them were basically they were people like Abdullah bin Mas'ud and Abu Darda. They were actually put under house arrest. And so we see a very aggressive policy during the early days of preventing the hadith of Rasulullah to be preserved in written form, and even preventing the ashab from circulating the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And mashallah, they call themselves Ahl Sunnah. This is what I'm saying. The labels can be misleading. You have to know the reality. And the people have to be told that this is the reality. And all this is done in the name of the Quran. Because we would like to maintain the supremacy of the Quran. If we have hadith, then people will not go to the Quran. Which is not really true. We know hadith is hadith and Quran is Quran. Quran is Kalamullah. And hadith is Kalam of Rasul narrated by the people. There is a big difference there. We have this whole issue of authenticity, non-authenticity, when it comes to hadith. We do not consider them to be on the same level. But even this excuse of trying to preserve the supremacy of the Quran, where the Prophet says, I'm living the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Even to preserve the Quran and to understand the Quran, you need the Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wa salam. Salawat Both these Khulafa have used this term that Quran is sufficient for us. Any question you have, refer people to the Quran. You don't need hadith in a way. And we know that when it comes to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it is Torah or Injil or Quran or any other revelation, there are only three possibilities. Many times we see that a human guide was sent with a book. Musa was sent with Torah. Isa was sent with Injil. Our Rasul was sent with the Quran. And many Anbiya were sent without books. So you have guides with books, you have guides without books. But there is not a single example where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have sent down a revelation to the people without a guide. So this whole idea of saying, the book is sufficient for us doesn't work at all. Yes, Allah had a power to reveal the book, in a mysterious ways. It didn't have to come through a human being, through a Rasul. He could have done that. It is within the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we see that never was a book sent without a guide. Because the book is always silent. People have the ability to misinterpret the book. Therefore, you always need a book with somebody who has been authorized to explain and teach the book to us. Salawat Akbar. Earlier, 2 or 3 days ago, I mentioned a statement from the Prophet where he says, I fought for the tanzeel of the Quran, for the revelation of the Quran, and Ali will fight for the ta'wil of the Quran, for the true interpretation of the Quran. And that's what we see in the reality when we talk about the Shia path. It is Ali. You heard these statements from him many times. Saluni qabla an tafqiduni. In one of those instances he says, ask me before you lose me. For I swear by the one who split the grain and created the soul, if you ask me about any verse of the Quran, whether it was revealed at the night or the day, in Mecca or Medina, during the journey of the Prophet or while he was in the city, whether it is abrogated or a verse which abrogates the other verse, whether it is a muhkam and clear verse or allegorical and mutashabih verse, I will give you the interpretation of that and I'll be able to inform you about it. Nobody among the Sahaba of Rasulullah could ever make a claim the way Amirul Mu'minin had made. Salawat Akbar. Let me see if I can give you one or two examples where the people who said that Quran is sufficient for us, there are many situations where they were forced to go to the Imam to understand the Quran itself. One of the this is the second Khalifa's time, where a man brought his wife to the Khalifa accusing her of adultery, and he asked him, what is the proof? He said, we were just married 6 months ago and she has given birth to a child. And so the Khalifa and all the Sahaba there said, yes, this is zina, this is adultery, she has to be punished. And when she was being taken for the punishment, when Amir al-Mu'minin heard the commotion outside in the street, he asked them, what is going on? And they told him the story in brief. And he says to these people, take her back to the masjid and ask the Khalifa to wait for me there. Amir al-Mu'minin goes, you can just think about the scenario there. Just go in your imagination there. Amir al-Mu'minin says, you people don't have a right to judge her in this way. Did she confess to adultery? No. Is there any witnesses for that? No. There is no confession, no witnesses. So how can you pass this judgment? And they said, well, she has given birth to a child just 6 months after her marriage, so it's not from the husband. And that is where Amir al-Mu'minin says that the minimum term of pregnancy is 6 months. This child belongs to the husband. Now there is a surprise. The Sahaba, all of them say, what is your proof? You can't just make a arbitrary, statement and say 6 months is the term of pregnancy. And this is not even 21st century where you have all this medical, science advancing, where you have the ability to even, save a child born premature. And Amir al-Mu'minin says it is there in the Quran. Many of them were Hafiz of Quran. They turned to him and they said, where is it there in the Quran? And Amir al-Mu'minin proved it to them that this is where we say the book by itself is not sufficient. You need somebody who can understand Quran fully. What Amir al-Mu'minin did was he recited 2 verses. They were probably looking for one. And that's where they didn't find the answer. But you have to go to somebody who has been joined with Quran by Rasulullah. When he says, إِنِّي تَارِكٌ فِيكُمْ ثَقَلَيْنِ, what did he do? He said, look at the ayat. And this is in Surah 46, ayat number 15. And these verses are not even close by. Surah 46, ayat 15 says, حَمْلُهُ وَفِصَالُهُ ثَلَاثُونَ شَهْرًا. Talks about, the suffering, the hardship that the mother goes through, and how, a person has to respect the mother. And then it ends by saying that the time of pregnancy and breastfeeding is 30 months in total. Then Amir al-Mu'minin says, go to Surah number 31, ayat 14, and read another ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the weaning time. And he says, وَفِصَالُهُ فِي عَامَّيْنِ. The weaning time is 24 months. He says, put these 2 ayats together. One ayat is talking about pregnancy plus the weaning time total, 30 months. The other is only talking about the weaning time, which is 24 months. You are left with 6 months, and that is the minimum term of the pregnancy according to the Quran. Salawat Quran Ekbar. They had the Quran in their hands. They had the Quran in their memory, but they didn't have the one who was waris of the Quran. They needed him to explain to them how to understand the Quran. Salawat Quran Ekbar. And it's not only during the days of Ali and the early Khulafa, even later on. If you look at the example of the 7th Imam, one of the early Khulafa of Banu Abbas, his name was Mahdi Abbasi. One day he was having a conversation with our 7th Imam, and he asked him, and it seems that this question was very common those days, and it seems to be still a common question among the Arabs even now. And the question was, does the Quran forbid khamr or not? Khamr means intoxicants. Is there an ayat which says intoxicants are haram? It means these Arabs those days still were saying, it doesn't say haram. There is no ayat which says haram. Even now I'm told some of these mu'mineen who lived in Saudi Arabia, sometimes they say that, we used to see some of these Arabs, drinking, and we would say, don't, this is not allowed. They said, it's only makruh. Where does it say in the Quran it's haram? We are Arab, we know Arabic. So it seems this question was not, it's not a new question even those days, because people looked for ayat of Quran. There are actually 3 to 4 ayat of Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited khamr gradually. But if you look at those ayat by themselves, the word haram has not come. And when Mahdi Abbasi asked our 7th Imam, he said, it is haram. It is haram in Quran. Now Mahdi Abbasi was, more confused. Maybe, he might have thought the Shias have a different Quran. This is another accusation we get. Imam said, no. Again, the seventh Imam did the same thing what his forefather, the first Imam, did. He said there are two ayat in Quran, read them together. You are looking for the word haram or the term harrama, which means it is forbidden. He says if you look at ayat number 33 from surah number 7, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قال أقل إنما حرم ربي الفواحش ما ظهر منها وما بطن والإثم والبغي بغير الحق. There is one ayat where the Prophet is told that say to the people that my Lord harrama means he has made haram. What he has made haram? Then the list goes on. Al-fawahish is first one. Fawahish means indecent acts. Wal-ithm is the second in the list. Al-ithm means sin in general. Then Imam says, go to Surah Baqarah, read ayat number 219. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. O Rasul, people ask you about khamr, intoxicants, and maysir means gambling. قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ. In both these things there is a severe or a major sin in it. Now Imam says, look at ayat together. One ayat is saying every ithm has been made haram by Allah. The word harrama has come. The second ayat now is applying the word ithm on the khamr. So every ithm is haram, khamr is ithm. So the logical conclusion would be that khamr is also haram according to the ayat of Quran. Salawat upon Quran. Let me end with a third example before I go to the Masa'ib. We come to the days of the 11th Imam. There was a scholar those days by the name of Ishaq al-Kindi. In the history of Muslim philosophers, he is known as the first proper philosopher. And he had some students who were also companions of our 11th Imam. They used to come to him also. And there was a time when he was writing a book about contradictions in the Quran. He believed that there are some ayat which contradict other ayat. So he was actually writing a book on it. And when our 11th Imam came to know about it, he told his companions, some of his students, who were also students of this fellow, Imam said, isn't there a Rajulun Rashid, a wise man among you, to go and advise him not to do what he's doing? How can there be, contradictions in the Quran? And they said, he's our teacher. How would we go and argue with him? Imam says, okay, I'll give you the arguments. Then who is going to go and talk to him? They said, we will try. And Imam gave the argument, and then they went. And one of them became the spokesman of the group. And they said, you have shared your things with us, your research about contradiction in the Quran. You said this ayat contradicts the other ayat. Then this fellow said, I have a question. When you say this ayat is contradicting the other ayat, how sure you are that you understood the ayats properly? Maybe it's your wrong understanding of one ayat which has created apparent contradiction. Maybe the meaning is something else, not what you think. And if the meaning is something else, then there would be no contradiction. Ishaq Kindi was a learned scholar, so he thought for a moment about it, and he said, this is a valid argument. I have to be 100% sure that this is the meaning of the ayat and the other ayat. Only then I can say, okay, now they are compatible or they are contradictory to one another. And if you are not sure about it, then I cannot make this claim. So then he looked at the student. Now he was a good teacher. He knew his level of intelligence. He says, أقسمت عليك إلا أخبرتني من أين لك. I ask you in the name of Allah to tell me, where did you learn this? And he says, well, it came to my mind. And he said, I know you. Your intelligence doesn't reach to that level. Until he was forced to say, Amarani bihi Abu Muhammad al-Askari, Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam has asked me to convey this argument to you. And that is where Ishaq al-Kindi says, Al-an ji'ta bihi. Now you have confessed and brought the truth. ما كان ليخرج مثل هذا إلا من ذلك البيت. Because such a statement of wisdom cannot come but from that house, which is the house of knowledge of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam. Salawat on you. And he gathered his manuscript and basically burned it. If it hadn't been for Ali, people would have been killed because of the wrong judgments of the Khulafa. If hadn't been for Imam Musa al-Kazim, the Muslims would have not understood that the Quran says khamr is haram or not. If it was not from Imam Hassan Askari alayhi salam, we would have the first Muslim philosopher having a book in which is talking about contradictions in the Quran itself. This is how the Ahlul Bayt have preserved the authenticity of the Quran and the knowledge of the Quran, and how they have made sure that people will come to them to understand what is the true meaning and the ta'weel of the Quran. Salawat alayhi. And this was not only in the family of the Ahlul Bayt, only the members who were ma'soom. This was there even preserved by the other members of the family, who always fought for the haqq. Not only those who were adults, even the young ones. We remembered yesterday Aun Muhammad. Today we are going to talk about another member of the family. Look at that understanding about what is haqq. On the eve of Ashura, you know the story, when Imam talked with his companions, and then when he got the allegiance from them, although he had asked them, released them of that burden, but they re-emphasized their allegiance to the Imam by their own choice. At the end, the Imam made a statement where he says, all of you are included in the list of the Shuhada tomorrow. A young boy in mid-teens stood up. He was not sure that when Imam is saying all of you are included in the list of Shuhada, is he only addressing the adults, or is he also including the young ones like me? And when Imam heard that statement, and that was Qasim bin Hassan, the level of love that Imam had for him, he first looked at his face, looked at his age of innocence in a way, and he says, "Oh my son, tell me, do you even understand the concept of maut and death? That you are asking whether you are included in the list of Shuhada or not?" And the way he responded was so beautiful, according to his age, where he says, "Ahla min al-asal." That, oh my uncle, for me death, the way you are describing it, in your cause, for you, for the sake of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is sweeter to me than the honey. This was the level of understanding of the children of the family of Ahlul Bayt. On the day of Ashura, when the mother of Qasim prepared mentally the son for the whole night, that it will be a day of sacrifice where you have to go and give your life in the name of your father. Qasim had become orphan at a very young age when his father died. He was raised in a way by Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And Imam actually loved him quite a lot. We are told by historians that when Qasim came to the Imam and asked for permission to go and fight, Imam refused. Imam refused until some of the historians say that he went all the way on his knees to beg to the Imam to give him the permission. But Imam was hesitant because he looked at Qasim. He used to remember his brother Hassan. He was basically the memory of his brother. But the way he has raised him like his own son, he was so near and dear to him that eventually when he gave him the permission, they started to cry. They hugged one another and started to cry, حَتَّى غُشِيَ عَلَيْهِمَا, until they almost passed out in a way. They became almost unconscious. Then Imam told him, go to the women, say Khuda Hafiz to them and then come back. And that is where Imam himself helped him to go on the horse. According to Hamid bin Muslim, who is the narrator, he says, I saw this young man whose face was shining like a moon coming towards the Yazidi forces, and I saw he was still young, that his feet could not go into the area where you put your feet on the saddle. He was still young at that time. And Hamid bin Muslim narrates how he fought. But a young man and thousands of enemies, he could not last long. Until when he is hurt in such a way that he comes down from the horse. At that time he called his uncle, Ya Ammahu Adrikni, oh my uncle, come to my help. When Hussein heard the cry of Qasim, out of this love that Imam Hussein alayhi salam had, he took out his sword and immediately attacked the Yazidi forces. And this is where, in the confusion, the cavalry force of the Yazidi force, the horses started going here and there, and that is where we see that by the time Imam Hussein alayhi salam reached, he saw that Qasim, now almost near his death, trampled with the horses which were going around from the east to the west. Imam sat down, saying to Qasim that it is really painful to me to realize that you called me for help, but I could not respond. And I responded to you at the time where I cannot help you anymore. And that is where, Qasim left this dunya. Imam raised him in a way that the chest of Qasim was attached, joined with the chest of Imam, and he started, taking his body towards the tent. Hamid bin Muslim says that I realized that the feet of Qasim were actually making trail on the sand going towards the tents. And this is where you have to realize this was a young boy, not that tall, but it seems when he was trampled by the horses, this is that his chest is with the chest of Hussein, but his feet are actually making mark on the sand. When he brought Qasim near the tents, this is where, when the mother looked at the body, the only thing she could say, she asked Imam, is this the body of my son? Because I don't think that he was that tall. How could Imam say that the Qasim, his body has been trampled by the horses? अज़दारान हुसैन बस एक जुमला कह के ख़त्म करना चाहेंगे। इमाम हुसैन के लाश को भी पामाल किया गया था, लेकिन वो लाशा था शहादत के बाद, लेकिन हाय कासिम, उनकी जिस्म में अभी जान मौजूद थी जब घोड़े इस तरह से मशरिक से मगरिब गए हैं कि जनाब कासिम का जिस्म पामाल हो चुका था। अला लानतुल्लाहि अलल कौमिज़ ज़ालिमीन, सयअलमुल लज़ीना ज़लमू अय्य मुनक़लिबिन यनक़लिबून।